I'm Mary Racelis, born in Manila, Philippines on January 11th, 1932. Happy, learning, and then, I don't know, the word is not traumatized, but fearful when the war started. Yeah. For us, for the kids, we were pretty sheltered. My sister, who was 2 grades ahead of me, being, as we always knew, the pretty one in the family and the fairer one, which in the Philippines, if you're fair, that's supposed to be much better. So she would get all the princess and queen's parts, and I would get the elves and the dancer parts, the mischievous ones. She and I were really very close, although we were very different. I mean, my sister, at the age, I don't know if I was 4 or whenever she was, maybe it was grade 1, she was learning geography, American geography. So she drilled me. I had to know the capital of every state in the Union. At the same time, there's this thing, you're always struggling to be as good as she is, but she can do much more because she's 2 years older. So you're always behind somehow, and somehow you make it up. And in my case, because I did so well in school, mostly better than she did, that I got accolades for that, right? So, but we were always together. We were very close, and my poor brother would always be weeping when my mother, I think we would go to a movie or something. My mother would always take the two of us, and he'd be left with the maid because she was too little before the war. And he would be left crying, and they would say, no, you have to go pick the racelis. Racelis are small fruit that you can pick and eat from the tree. And that kind of became a symbol for him, that if he heard, you can pick racelis, he'd start crying, I don't want to pick. He wanted to come with us. Yeah. And so the two of us kind of sometimes ganged up on him, But she really doted on him, and she would say, where's my little bit of a boy? And from wherever he was, outside, when he heard her say that, he knew he had to say, I'm here, and then that was okay. So because of that, that's how we called him Biddy, because of that. Where's my little bit of a boy? And well, so, but the two of us, because we played the piano together, we went to ballet together, I remember, I guess one of our happiest moments is we had a big mango tree during the war in our garden. And mango trees have a lot of branches, and you can climb them, and they have, you establish your place to sit where you have your book and you read in a tree. Right? So we each had our place, and you couldn't use her. I couldn't go to hers, and she couldn't come to mine. We lived upstairs. The other two families had the other 2 rooms, and downstairs was the porch, which had sliding doors. So that became our stage. We slid the door open, and all our families were there. And so we, it was the most creative time ever. And we enjoyed it enormously. We walked all over the place, maybe not so much him, but my sister and I, because that neighborhood was pretty safe, and it was all rice fields, and we would just walk to one another's house because, there wasn't much transportation around. When the war started, 1941, I was 9 years old. So at 9, you remember a lot. The war declaration was certainly a turning point. We were home from school because I went to Catholic school, St. Joseph's Academy, where December 8th was the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. So we were home on holiday, and the phone rings, and I think my father called my mother to say Pearl Harbor was bombed. And so she turned on the radio, and then we got all that information. And I remember we were stunned. We didn't really, of course, as kids, know what did that mean. But at 9, when Pearl Harbor was bombed, that had something to do with you, and it was very clear that the same could happen to us, and in fact, it did. The war started, then the question is, what do we do? And my uncles, aunts, my parents were consulting one another at what's the next step. And the fear was that the Japanese were going to invade, invade the Philippines any day. So we had to get out of the city. The Japanese already had come. Yeah, they confiscated our house because my mother, it was in the name of my mother. They bought it in her name. It was registered under her, and she was an American. So that's why it was captured by them as enemy property. That's why we had to leave there. And we moved in with our cousin, Uncle Jesse, and the Antonio side. Those are the ones who lived right by the river, where we would have tremendous floods every year. My parents and uncles and aunts decided that we should all leave. We should become internal refugees, you might say, and go to my aunt's house in Laguna, which is a province. We evacuated to Magdalena. Actually, the kids, we had a wonderful time because we were in the province. We had never been. And every night there was coming together and discuss, listening to the radio. Where are the Americans? When are they coming back? Assumption was, it's just a matter of a few months. We were there, I think, until shortly after January 1st, because then the Japanese announced that they would declare Manila an open city, which meant they would not bomb it. There was a private library with a lot of children's books, so we would borrow. We were there with most of my cousins were also there, and we would borrow books, and we would do a lot of reading. And that, I think, is something all three of us recognize the importance of having both parents who really believed in books. I mean, of course, my mother being a librarian, that's to say that, goes without saying, but my father loved to read, and he loved knowledge. Where do you get all kinds of knowledge? So we always had books as we were growing up. I mean, looking back at it now, so we didn't go to school because my parents said, you're not going to school where, which is Japanese run. They went through all the books, and they would cut out any reference to the United States, to Abraham Lincoln, to any American flag, any pictures of flags. So you had school books, especially in history, that were full of holes in the pages because they had cut them out. They hired people to do that. My sister and I continued going to ballet school. We were very much aware of the Japanese presence and the dangers because you would hear stories all the time about the guerrillas and how if they were captured, they would be tortured. But there was a very strong guerrilla movement. And, we tried to keep track of and to know what were they doing, what did they know, because often they were connected with Americans somewhere in the mountains. So we would try to, there was a whole network of trying to get that information. The thing is, we had a shortwave radio, and that was absolutely forbidden. What happened was when the war started, when the Japanese then came in, they confiscated all the radios to remove all the shortwave so that nobody could hear anything other than what they wanted to promote. But they had to hire a lot of Filipino technicians, of course, to do all that work, because this is thousands of radios. And my cousin Jesse was one of them, because he was a radio specialist. And he told us, they had this kind of secret pact, the Filipino technical people, that more or less, if they could, 1 out of every 10 or 15 or 20, they would try to leave it intact. And just by chance, when we got our radio back, ours was one of the ones left intact. And that kept my mother going the whole war. Plus my father too, because she would relay the message. But she would spend hours trying to listen to the radio. And the sound was very faint because it was a broadcast from Australia about how is the war going on in Guadalcanal and all those Pacific islands, were gradually being captured, or the Americans were losing for a long time. And Bataan happened in Corregidor, where the Americans had to go on the death march, and all of those, atrocities. That was all being reported there, which you would never hear from the Japanese side. If we had been caught, if the Japanese had known that, we would have all been captured, tortured, and killed. Right? So it was a very dangerous thing. And the question is, especially when it was clear the Americans were getting closer and closer, should we evacuate again? But then nobody was sure where are they going to land. So there was a lot of speculation. Are they going to land in northern Luzon? Because there are many ports. In south, if we go south back into Laguna and they land here, then the fighting is going to be exactly there. So where do you go? So that was always the subject, which is the safest place to be. In the end, they decided to stay more in place. But the big change then came in October. I remember that, 44, when the bombing started. I remember that first day, you could hear that drone, and the P-36s were flying, and there were bombers also. And then you would have these dogfights. By that time, they had already built the air raid shelter outside. Well, you heard about the trap door. There was a kind of a tunnel or a pathway to get outside in case the house burned down, and that pathway then led to the air raid shelter that they built. It was a kind of a crude one, just dug into the ground. It had a long bench raised because it was often flooded since it was, low. And it had sandbags on top. And at the beginning, when those bombings first started, all of us, my cousins, my auntie, we'd all be there, all crowded, for hours until the bombing was over. But as it began, when every day it was like that, and the bombing was far. It was always of military targets, so we figured we were far from that. Then one day, because we were on the second floor, and it looked west, I think. So one day, again, you could hear the bombing coming, and of course my aunties and my mother saying, right, get down there. And we always wanted to watch, because you would see the planes, dive bombing and shooting one another and so on. But we were resisting going down into the air raid shelter when we saw that of a formation of P-36, or maybe it was the bombers, we saw smoke begin to come out of one. In other words, aircraft, because there was aircraft from the ground always going there.
P-25.
P-25, yeah.
Mitchell bombers.
Yeah. So we saw smoke coming out. And then the American plane began to drop out. And then we realized it's coming toward us. We ran so fast. My aunt, who never walked more than 3 paces per 5 minutes, ran the 4-minute mile, I think, because we all were sure this plane was coming right at us. So we all drove into that air raid shelter, and the plane exploded, but 3 parachuted out. So the motor fell in the marketplace, which was down the hill. Another part of the wing, I think, or was fuselage, fell in our 3 neighbor lots away. And I don't know where the other parts were, but they were all scattered. And the 3 airmen came down into a pretty crowded neighborhood where the guerrillas saw them, of course, so did the Japanese, and they just whisked them away. And when the Japanese got there, they said, what soldiers? Nobody would admit that the Americans had parachuted into their neighborhood. And so I think that neighborhood, they're all picked up and they were all tortured, but I don't think they ever told. Anyway, the system got them, with the guerrilla system, they got them out, I think. So that's where the 3 of us, invented all kinds of games just to while away the moment, the telephone game and whatever, word games. We were very creative. You had to be, because you had no other choice. But that was already October, November, December. I mean, the bombing was every day. So then we knew, okay, the Americans are going to invade very soon. Should we stay there in our house? And they said, probably it's safe, they decided, because we were right on the Manila water line. That big tubes, or tubo as they used to say, that went to the city, came by our street. Or the Americans will not want to disrupt the water system of the whole city, so that's pretty safe, we should stay there. Okay, so that was a decision. Then, not long, when was that? I guess it was already maybe January 45. Somehow they found out that they were digging it because they were going to put, explosives, landmines, to blow up the water system if there was an invasion of the Americans. When all of them heard that, it's time to leave. And they had made an agreement with a distant relative who was down the hill near the market that we could move in with them, kind of like a third cousin, Eleazar. So we wound up there, and that's when really the shelling and the bombing, that was the invasion of Manila. I remember throwing things into pillowcases and all of us just running down the hill with what we could carry. But Manila itself, that was really being bombed. There was fire and all of that. And that's where the main Battle of Manila was. But we were far outside of the city, or we were on the fringe. So we were kind of seeing, but we didn't know what was going on there, but we just saw flames, big flames. The whole of Manila was aflame. And that's when when that happened, then we fled down the hill. But that's where we were when all of a sudden we heard, the Americans are here. And so, first I think all the adults went out to see if this was true, and sure enough, we saw the tanks, the 1st Cavalry Division, which was not horses, but tanks, coming up our street. And the soldiers, American soldiers, were sitting on top of the tanks because they had now defeated the Japanese, and they were coming up our street. And my father, who had saved 5 bottles of scotch the entire war, which he could have sold for thousands of pesos by that time because it was so rare, he saved them. And he went out with my mother. Can you imagine when they see an American woman? And the two of them are handing out a bottle of scotch to people who just got out of a battle, to the first 5 tanks. I mean, that was some event. And they began, they were throwing down chocolates and all kinds of spam to the population. Yeah, chewing gum, yeah. So those are really great, great moments. Wow. Then I guess they contacted my mother or said, the Americans who were there, who were the women mainly, married to Filipinos, were told that they could go back, the United States would repatriate them. So that's how we then got to go back. After the Americans came back, then my school called the older girls to come and help because there were so many. The nuns turned it into a semi-hospital. There were so many injured people. So they asked some of the older girls to go and help. And I wanted to go, but I was, 13, whereas my cousins were already 18, 19. And they went back. But I went, you could do things like bring water. And when you see, really, people injured, kids, many kids, who were really hurt, but that's when you see the anger, what the war does, to people, and this what's so-called collateral damage. I mean, collateral damage is people really died or were suffering, or split up, and that's when you see that. First of all those dead bodies of the Japanese soldiers, and it becomes sort of the norm, right? The norm. That's it. But then all the suffering, then I think that really gets you to think you have to do something in this world to make it, that it doesn't happen again, even though it didn't work very well that way. Huh? But you do what you can. You're sort of sad because when are you going to see your cousins again? The dog, Buster, we called Mutter, and just our friends. But we were also very excited because for us, the United States was the land of plenty, you know, with gold-lined streets. I mean, it's a wonderful place. And my father loved the United States, and he loved American values. And I mean, he was, I think, more enthusiastic than my mom. I mean, mom just took it, of course, she was an American, right? And but he loved having been a student there. He loved how democratic it was. I mean, for a Filipino at that time, in the 20s, you know, when all that anti-Asian stuff was, but he never seemed to feel. So we grew up, the United States is kind of the shining place to go. So I think we were very excited that at last, you know, we would see this country. Yeah, well, I was already 13. This is 1945. So it's we arrived there in May, stayed with my grandmother in Flushing. She was overwhelmed by us, I think. First of all, you know, my mother had been away 16 years, so I guess they had to make amends of some kind. And all of a sudden, she has 3 young kids in a very small, pretty small apartment in Flushing, who all had accents. And you know, she had certain ideas about how things should be and discipline, and, you know, we didn't like being told what to do by somebody whom we didn't really know. We were very not enthusiastic about our grandmother at the time. So we wanted to get out as fast as possible. And when we found this apartment in the Bronx, because a friend of my mother's who had been on the boat with us, also an American married to a Filipino, said, hey, there's an apartment, you know, in my building. So we got that. It was just a 1-bedroom, and there were 3 of us, 3 kids, my mother, and then later my father. You know, growing up as a Filipino American, okay, if you're in the Philippines and you're an American and you're fairer than most, you have an advantage. I mean, you are kind of, you're special, you're looked up to in a way. I mean, you get teased also, then. But because you belong to 2 worlds, even though the world there was the Philippine world. But of course, my experience of it would be different from a full Filipino child. Because you have an American mother who thinks one way, and your father more or less goes along with that because of the American side. But you live in the Philippine world. You learn to be, I think it makes you learn to be adjustable, always to be looking at both sides of things, you know, trying to figure out where are you in all of this, because you're not sure, and how do people see you, because you can act in a certain way because you think of who you are, and then, but maybe they don't see you that way. So you're always unsure of who are you, you know, your identity always becomes a kind of an issue. So that can be a problem, but it can also be an advantage in that that's who you are, and once you realize that, then you just, you know, you use it as your strengths rather than see it as a disadvantage. Especially if, I mean, of course, if you were discriminated against, if I had been raised made in the American South, perhaps I would have seen it differently, but because, you know, my American half, being half-half, was so valued, then you flourished. But you always have this identity problem. You're not really sure. And then because I didn't speak Filipino well, since we grew up speaking English, even though I understood it because my cousins and all of them, although they always spoke English to us, but you hear it all the time. So you learn to understand it, but you never speak it. And that was a big disadvantage, and was a big, when I returned, I could barely speak the language, and yet I was now, and especially only when I started to do research in these villages, that I had no choice. You know, I had to force myself. And it's also because I had a strange Filipino accent. I mean, I had an accent because I had an American, sort of American accent. You could tell that's not my native tongue. And so sometimes in the early days, people, they would laugh, they would think my Tagalog was so cute, but of course you don't think it's so cute, you know it doesn't sound right, you know, so you hesitate to speak it unless you can speak it really well. I go to this public school. Okay, you know, because my mother said, "No way, you're going to Catholic school." Now that she was there, my father was not. She said, "No, you're going to the public school." So we go. All my Italian American friends and Irish, who are my neighborhood friends, all go to the Catholic school there, and my sister and I went to the public school. I get there, and they don't know quite what to do with me because they gave me tests. And in math and social studies, I was third grade level because I hadn't gone to school for all that time. But in reading and writing, I mean composition, I was fourth year high school equivalent because I had done so much. So I didn't quite know what to do with me. So they put me in seventh grade because, well, they couldn't put me in fifth to start again where I left off. So they put me in seventh grade. And then the first semester I did very well, so they skipped me one term. A teacher, Mrs. Schwanemann, her was her name, Margaret Schwanemann, German-American, who had a terrific Bronx accent, I remember that. And I was in her homeroom class, and she saw that, you know, that I was smart and from the reading part, but she saw that I was also very far behind in math. So she decided that I had to catch up, and she decided she would tutor me herself. And she made me go then to her apartment in the Bronx, in North Bronx, the better part of the Bronx, every Saturday for a long time. And she would just tutor me on her own for free, you know, just to bring me up to date. And so that then I caught up because of her. And that's when you know, people like that who go all out for you, then you know you have to do it to somebody else. I think I got along with everybody. And the smart ones tended to come together, and the teachers kind of encouraged that, you know. So I had two very good black friends, two sisters, who invited me to their house. You know, I got to know them, and a Hispanic, also an Hispanic friend, and an American white girl. So we got along. You know, you had that kind of group, but that's when you see what poverty is. You know, this is a country that, you know, we always thought of as everybody lives so well and so on, and then you're in the middle of a whole group of really poor girls. And that's when we realized that not everybody assumes that they're going to college, as we always did when we were little. I mean, my father, well, certainly not both parents, but my father, you'd think a male would have something, well, girls can't do this. Never. You know, it was always, no. I mean, you can be whoever you want. What do you want to be? You know, always that. So, assumption you go to college. Then I discovered that many of my friends had no intention of going. I mean, it wasn't even on their horizon, you know. I was so stunned by that, you know, that not everybody thinks that they should go to college or valued it even. It was not on their horizon. They said, you should apply to Hunter High. And they made sure that we got the registration papers and that we filed them on time and that we submitted them. And the two of us got in. I don't know if others also filed, but anyway, it's only the two of us who got in. But I did very well in school. I became the head of the student organization. But then I got to Hunter High, and that made all the difference because that was a school, public school, but it was for talented girls. But at Hunter, everybody was smart, so you really had to compete and study hard. But the great thing was you competed with other girls, and you could compete as a girl with other girls. So, I mean, looking at it later, if there had been boys in the school, as there are now, we think, but there weren't then, you would have had to, you know, you have the whole dating thing. And if you want to date this guy, you shouldn't show that you're so smart. In those days, this is the 50s. Because if you're smart, boys won't like you, that kind of thing. We didn't have to deal with that. I would say 3/4 were immigrant kids, mostly from Europe. So we were in the Spanish class, and we, you know, you bonded. And those are still the friends I have now from high school. Well, first the Spanish cluster, we were the closest. The whole culture of the school was that every girl had the capacity to excel, because that's how you got in there, which means you were already recognized as somebody who had capacity. Then I gave the graduation speech. Of course, that was a disaster. I had written a speech, and they said, you have to memorize it, you know. Yeah, and so I had it on this paper. And as we were preparing for graduation, my teacher said, so where are your note cards? I said, I don't have note cards, it's on this paper. She said, you cannot open a paper like that in front of this audience. You should have it on note cards. So in the last minute, I'm putting it on note cards, about 10 of them. And of course, I don't know where, as cueing, I didn't know what parts of the speech were in which card. And of course, you're supposed to have memorized it anyway. So when I'm giving the speech, for this all the parents are there, the teachers are there, the students are all there, and I get to a part and I forget. And I didn't know where on the card that section was, because I didn't have the paper which would have told me where it was. So I remember a pause and everybody's waiting, and I said, well, anyway, I think we can continue on by saying, and then I got to the part where I could remember, and people kind of laughed. But I remember that was such a trauma, you know, waiting. And it's one of those, wait till the last minute. It's not usually smart in the end. Sometimes you get away with it, but that time I didn't get away with it. And you just make do, you know, what you have to do. When I was living in the Bronx, I went to study ballet, and my mother encouraged me to do that. At that time, I really wanted to go on stage, and you know, as a singer-dancer on Broadway. That was my dream. Then I went to summer camp, Echo Camp on Racket Lake, and that's when I became a swimming instructor there. And so then I thought, I want to be an Olympic diver. But then when I got into high school, where everybody's so oriented, and then doctor was good, because then you were serving humanity, and that's what I wanted to do. But I also had to take speech therapy, can you believe? Because they said I still had an accent, and I had a lisp, S, you know, I had an S problem. So every Tuesday, I think, you had to stay after school for speech clinic, and you had to practice slowly, silently. Now the moon shifts her light on a silver shoon, all the S's, this way and that. She peers and sees silver something on silver trees. All right, so you had to improve your language at Hunter High. Okay, right. So I wanted to be a doctor. Well, I took the science track in high school. Then I wanted to go to a co-ed school. I had been in girls' school my whole life. I said, I have to go to a co-ed college. But I wanted a school where it was not huge, but not too small either. It had to be co-ed and had to be out of town, out of New York City, right? So one of them was Cornell. I found this, and after I looked, that's the only place I wanted to go. That's the only place I applied. I was there really for only 3 years, because, you know, I already had advanced credits, and then I went to summer school twice. Well, when I went there, I didn't know what I wanted to major in, and you know, they just give you courses. You have to take a certain number in each field. In social sciences, they gave me Sociology 101 or something. And I had a teacher who was very good, Peter Blau, who became very famous later on as a sociologist. He was excellent, and I liked the subject. And in the midterm, I got 100. You know, I'm the only one in the whole class who got 100. So I said, gee, you know, I'd never heard of sociology before. So I said, maybe this is a good field for me. Well, I went in as very Catholic. I joined the Newman Club. I went to their activities. You know, you meet all the other Catholic kids. It was very nice. But after the second semester, or that semester when I started attending these classes on my own, and was so disheartened by what I discovered about the Reformation and what the Catholic Church did, that I said, what is that? Anyway, so the questioning begins, right? And I thought I should learn about other religions. So I saw this, I saw a course advertised that said non-Western religions. So I said, oh, that must be about Buddhism and Hinduism. I'm going to take this. So I enrolled in that. To my total surprise, the first day, it was not about Buddhism, but it was non-traditional. It was indigenous people, right? It was anthropology. I never knew what anthropology was. It was total accident that I took that, thinking it was like a philosophy course. It was an anthro course. But that's when I discovered, wow, this is really interesting. And my department was sociology and anthropology, so it was still within, the area where I had already started. So I said, this is wonderful. And coming to the US and cross-culture and being half-half, all of that began to fall into place once you study anthro. So then I decided that's my field. And from then on, I took all anthropology courses, had great teachers. And in college, I had a very good time. I joined the church choir, and we sang great songs, the Palestrina, and all combined. So we call ourselves the campus choraleers, and we also had rehearsals, and somebody in the music department helped us. So I did things like that, music, and going to art lessons, and doing my Cornell productions, shows, things. That I became a producer for Cornell shows. And what they did was they had a roster of students who had singing, dancing, any kind of talent. And you became a producer. You contacted them and you produced a show which you would take someplace to the area, usually old people's homes, orphanages. All right, so they would perform and all of that. And then you chat you play with the kids, you chat with the elders and all of that. The thing is, in freshman year, I did, I went through the sorority rush and with my mother and reading all these books about the United States. Joining a sorority was to me like it's the height of, wonderful. So I went through this and I decided to join Chi Omega. And I decided that because, they seemed to be a bit more diverse. Toward the end of the year, I said, I'm depledging. Well, horror, nobody depledges. I had thought that was the wonderful part of college. And then I discovered that at least the Chi Omega that I joined was not what I thought. I decided instead to go to France to study French, because by then I had met Helmut, my to-be husband, at Cornell. He was an economics, 1 year Fulbright exchange student, and we met there. So that summer, instead of going to Latin America, my professor was very upset because he really wanted me to come. But instead I went to study 1 month in Tours, which I also loved, and then I went to Austria. No, second year, I guess, when I met Helmut. I met him at the Cosmopolitan Club. It was the international club. My roommate, Sylvia Dutra, who had been going to that, she was half Portuguese, Portuguese ancestry, from Rhode Island, nice girl, and she would go to that. I hadn't been going there, and she said, why don't you come? They're going to have this and that. And she said, there's a guy that's really, I really like him, and so on. And so I said, yeah, okay, I'll come with you. And I went. And then I met Helmut, whom she was very interested in. And then he got all interested in, the two of us got along so well that he didn't pay any attention to her. Of course, they were not at all connected, but she was really eyeing him. And then I kind of took him over it. When we got home that night, she was furious at me. She said, you stole him from me, and what a traitor you are. I said, no, what do I know? Anyway, so when I met him, then, at the Cos Club we would meet, but, the events. But then I said, this guy is really something. So I found out what his schedule was. Remember that? And when you took me to Cornell, I showed him that. I found out his schedule, and I would come out of my Goldwyn Hall class, and he would come out of, I think, an economics class. And I knew exactly where he would be walking. So I would be walking, and I'd say, "Oh, hi! Hey!" What? And he'd say, "Ah, nice to see you. Let's go have a cup of coffee," which was at the Willard Straight Hall. So we'd have coffee. And I would always organize that I would, quite by accident, meet him. The first few times after that, we would decide. But he never knew that. And many years later, I told him that. "Do you remember that we would meet?" He said, "I had no idea that was happening." Then he was finished with the year, and he went to, he and his Greek friend went to the West Coast to earn, I think they were loading boxes of peas or something in a warehouse to earn. And then he went back to Austria, but we kept writing letters. And then, so what was that? That was my junior year already. We were writing, and I said, "Oh, that must be when I went to study French in Tours." But I had another, actually, guy, Steve was his name, who was in the Cornell Industrial Labor Relations School, very activist, Jewish guy. And we were dating. And then I went off to Europe, and he thought we were kind of connecting. But after I met Helmut again then, and I came back and told this guy, Steve, "No, I'm engaged," I think he was really upset. You know, "How come you never told me? I am telling you now." So that was junior year. Then I went to Tours, and then I went to Austria. I mean, I really pursued him, right? And he was already working in Austria, in Salzburg. So I went, and you know, his mother, he was staying with his mother, stayed with his mother, and you know, we went around, went to Vienna and stayed at his aunt's house. And I think then we went to Grinzing, which is the new wine in August, I think it's coming in. That's when I think we decided we'd get married. His aunt had said, "Helmut, now be sure she should not drink more than ein Viertel, 1/4, one glass of wine. She's not used to wine," and I really wasn't. And of course I drank 2 or 3 because it was so good, and then I got so sick on the way back on the tram that I threw up all over the tram. Can you believe it? And we were just engaged, and that's how it started. Threw up all over. So he had to pay a fine because they had to clean up the tram for me. And his aunt was really angry at him. She said, "I told you." So I had to recover in her house. You know, I felt so bad. Anyway, so we go back to Salzburg from Vienna and tell his mother. Yeah, in German, she says, "Now, Helmut, I like Mary very much. She's really a very nice girl. But I'm not going to have a daughter-in-law with whom I can't speak. So she has to learn German." So, okay. Go back to school, change my schedule, enroll in 12 units of German for the senior year. And they have a very good, you know, language program because you have language labs and you learn to speak and you memorize dialogues and have lectures. And so by the end of the year, I was pretty good in German, you know, fairly good. So by the time I got back to Austria, but I think that's after we were married already, and we went to Manila via Austria, and we would be with all the Verwandte, the relatives, you know, and his mother would say to them all, "Look at my daughter-in-law. She speaks proper German, High German," because of course you study High German in school, not like you with your dialect German. Speaks proper German. So she was very proud of me because I could speak good German, which they revered as intellectually acceptable. Yeah, so she and I got along very well all the time because I could speak to her and she could speak to me. When she died, I was in Austria. That was the summer I was in Austria. And I had been in France. And in those days, you didn't have cell phones. You know, there was no cable. They couldn't, where was I? And I don't know, the phone, well, the phone system, how do you call France, you know, from there? While I was on my way to Austria, I think that happened. And when I got to Austria, there was a letter there from Bob's sister to tell me what had happened. And I mean, being devastated, you know. And it's really something when you're away and someone close to you dies like that. And the closure, it doesn't happen because we were not there. And even when you go back, there's a grave, you know, and you remember her. But all of a sudden, you know, there's this blank in your life of somebody who was so close to you. Even though, I guess by that time, we had moved into separate categories. I was in college. She had gone to 1 year, and then she dropped out because she met Bob Lockley when we were at summer camp in the Adirondacks. And they fell in love and all of that. So they decided they were going to get married. My father was not happy because he wanted her to finish college. And Bob was, you know, he was not a college boy. He was working in the whole apple field of upper New York State. And so my father was not happy about that. And me, stupid me, I mean, when you think of it now, what was I? I think I was a senior, maybe still in high school. And when they said they were going to get married, just in, you know, small, and they were Protestant, so in a Protestant church. And at that time, you know, I'm Catholic. I can't walk into a Protestant church. It's very sinful. I mean, you know, I think of it. I mean, it's another reason I blame the church for being so negative. I mean, one, you belong, but at the same time, you see all the weak parts of it. And so I said, I'm not going. You know, and I think of it now, what is stupid. How much I regret it. Like he says, you know, there are times in your life you regret something that you can't change anymore. But I said, I'm not going. Why are you kidding? You're getting married in a Protestant church, you know, it should be in a Catholic church. I'm not coming if you're not. You know. But then, you know, later on, when they moved up to Williamson and she had the babies, of course, then I would visit there. Because then my mother moved up, so on vacations, on Thanksgiving and so on, I'd go to Williamson instead of New York. I was pregnant by a month later, and so that was Susie. And we went on to Austria on the way to the Philippines. Helmut initially had planned, I think even before we were married, he was going to go to Argentina or Brazil. He was very adventurous. He didn't like being in Austria. He felt it was too rigid a country. So he wanted to go there. But when my father heard that we were getting married, he wrote a letter to my father to ask for my hand and all of that, and told him that we were thinking of going to Brazil. My father said, Brazil? Why are you going to Brazil? If you're going to leave the United States, then you should go, you should go to the Philippines. Why go to Brazil? So Helmut said, oh, okay. And that's why we agreed. And so we went to Manila via Austria, and that's where I was already pregnant, so I arrived in Manila. I was about five months pregnant or something. We had this apartment in Elmhurst, Queens, a basement apartment, but we had to sign a lease of a year, and we were not there more than 6 months. And I remember the owner was a German also, and we thought, you know, they got along because they would speak in German. But when he discovered that we were not going to stay, then he really got nasty, and he happy to be out of school. I'd been in school forever. Happy, you know, housewife. That was the dream. In the 50s, the dream was you're a housewife, you have a house in the country, or, I mean suburban, you have a car, and you know, you prepare nice meals for your husband, who's the earner, and he comes home. I mean, all of that 1950s thing. And so it sort of carried over, you know, in our life. We had a nice house, and Susie was born, and he liked the Philippines a lot because, so we had birds, these colorful birds. We had a monkey. You know, he was thrilled with being in the tropics. Then we got a boat, a little boat, which we would sail in Manila Bay, and he called it the Susie, called it after Susie. Yeah, it was hard, but you know, when you have maids, that can make all the difference. You never have to cook. You know, there's always somebody taking care of the kids. So we had first one, and then we had two. So, you know, you could leave the house and they would be there. Somebody was taking care of them. That's the only way you could manage it. I mean, I could never have done that in the United States, for sure. And although as they grew older, he learned from his sisters that he couldn't assume that because he was a boy, he didn't need to do that, and because they were girls, they had to do that. And I remember it was in high school. They were in high school. Two girls were in college, and two were in high school, and he was in high school. He would come home. We divided up the tasks to be done at home, and he once came with his friends, and they cooked up spaghetti, and they left all the dishes in the sink. And when the girls came home, saw that, they said, "Hey, if you think we're washing those dishes, you're crazy. Come, you better wash them yourself." That kind of thing. So he grew up in a household where he had to learn, you know, that males don't have all the privileges that they think they should have, because they would always put him in his place. As they got older and became themselves more, you know, feminist-oriented or rights-oriented. Well, I mean, of course, with Susie, your first one, everything is a discovery, and it's a delight. Of course, all the problems of, you know, late-night feeding, you don't really know. Things like keeping her all bundled up when it's 85 degrees out, things like that you don't know, that normally you would learn from your mother, except she was not around, so you kind of have to learn it on your own. Although you read baby books, but everything was a discovery, and it was really thrilling, because Helmut was thrilled also. I mean, he doted on her. I mean, he called the boat that we had after her Susie, the Susie we called it. So, yeah, that was great. So the second one, I think, came as a surprise so soon after. But she was always really different also, right? But there I was much more knowledgeable, more comfortable, and you knew more or less what you could expect of the household help who were taking care of them. So the two of them were always together. They dressed alike, or at least Aunt Edith, who would buy them all their clothes for my father. They were often, especially the party dresses, they would be always dressed so together. Then Karen came along, November, and I was about 8 months pregnant when my father got that heart attack in Olongapo City. He was visiting the bank there, and he was supposed to play golf with the admiral the admiral of the U.S. Navy in the naval base at that time. The next day, they were good friends. Admiral Spring, that's it. And but while he was in the town, he had this heart attack, and they immediately called the admiral to say he had had his heart attack. He's not going to be coming. Admiral immediately sent an ambulance, picked him up, and took him to the Naval Hospital. And I think he survived because he got the best possible care. If he had gone to a local hospital, I don't know what would have happened. But he got there, and that's where he became so enamored of anything Navy, which is why when he built this house, which Karen now lives in, it looked like a boat. I mean, the lot was shaped like a boat, so he built a boat on it, and that became, he named it El Rey, after Elsie and Ray. Well, anyway, the reason I connect that was because I was pregnant with Karen, so I couldn't visit him until a week after she was born, which is about a month later. And I remember taking her up there as only 1 week, but I was breastfeeding, so that was all right, you know, and taking her out there to the base and back, and so that was her kind of introduction to a life of travel, I think, you know, in her first week, because you had to travel Manila up to where the Navy base was. You don't really make a distinction among them because you don't know what makes them different until they begin to grow older. Peter, again, Helmut was saying, that's enough, 3 is enough, but then, we didn't have a boy, and well, so when it turns out to be a boy, that was sort of okay. All right, so we had the boy. But then, I was saying, it's sort of sad because he's all by himself. The 3 girls are kind of together. And maybe we should have another boy, but, and then it turns out it was Teresa. So that was that. And he used to bully Teresa, which was really bothered me. But she claims that we didn't defend her enough anyway. But so, yeah, for me, it was nice to have a boy because I know Helmut wanted a boy. And he really tried to bring up boy things. Even as a little kid, he would take him ever to cockfights, to male type things, fishing. They'd go fishing out in Manila Bay. And then Teresa, and she laments that she doesn't have any baby pictures. He was always the picture taker because he had one of those German Leica cameras, I think. And, by the 3rd one, you don't take so many pictures anymore. In those days you had film, so you had to be somewhat, careful about how much you took. So when you have all 5 of them, you realize how different they all are. Susie was, being the eldest, she always, she runs things more like, she assumes that you have prerogatives. The eldest always has prerogative of some kind. And then Lisa, being the second, always kind of learning from the first, all right. But she was also much more artistic, always. Was very fastidious, very careful about how she dressed, and so on. Karen came, and she turned out to be the best in school. Did the best in school. Peter, being, kind of favored, especially by his father, I think, really got some good training from him, which I thought was a good idea. And Teresa was always the youngest, so the baby, and I think she got babied. I think she was especially loved because she was the youngest and very sweet and, obedient and compliant. All the time. So, yeah, so that what amazes you is how they all grow up in the same household and yet they're all really very different. And you learn to appreciate them. And, someone, your relatives or somebody will say, who's your favorite? And I always say, I don't have any favorites. Each one has his own or her own talent, skills, so everybody's the same. I love them all. Enjoying their company and having many, while that can be a problem, it makes it a household that's a very lively household. It's a noisy household, but noisy is usually lovely. You see it as a pleasant. So growing up, and then watching them each develop his or her own skills, talents, and you're always anxious that whatever their talents are, that you help them develop it, and you don't make any prior judgments about what they should be or what you want them to be, but let them develop their own. Yeah. So so every day is a kind of a discovery, and different ones you discover different things, different days. But because I was also traveling so much, I often wondered whether did they resent it, or was that a problem for them? I tried to accommodate in certain ways. That we moved across the street from the university when I was really full-time now for a long time. So that, and I always told my secretary, if any of my kids calls me on the phone, no matter who I'm talking to, or whatever I'm doing, put them on. Never make them feel that they can't reach me. And that was one rule. And the other was that they would feel comfortable dropping by the office, coming by, because they were really just across the street. Although they went to school not so far away. So they were, every time we had Christmas parties in my office, they were part of the performance group, and they were pretty good at it. But all of those, you never know whether you can compensate for not being there all the time. It's not the frequency necessarily, it's the intensity of interaction. So even if you don't have 24/7 with them, if you have only 3 and 4 and then they're asleep, those 3 or 4 hours make them really high quality interaction. And I remembered that. I mean, I really took that very seriously. So I would try to do that anyway. Every Sunday from that time on, we would always have dinner. I'd go to church with the kids. Sometimes someone came, sometimes they didn't. But we would always have Sunday dinner after church. And that would be something special. I mean, for us it'd be roast chicken with stuffing and mashed potatoes. And that you sit around the table and no arguments, no fighting. If you have any, if you can't sit and have a nice conversation, either be quiet or best just go. No fighting. So, the attempt was to make at least one time of the day or in the week when we're all together, interacting as a family. So, yeah, and I think they remember that still. Okay, my first job was as a camp counselor at Echo Camp in Waterfront. And then, that was camp. Then the second one was waiting tables at Cornell. And after graduation, working at the UN as a clerk typist. And then I went back to Manila, did an MA. What did I do? Peace Corps. Then I was a research associate at the Institute of Philippine Culture and teacher in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. But in the summers, 3 of those summers, I was teaching Peace Corps volunteers in California, cultural side. Right, so that job. And then came UNICEF in New York, Senior Policy Specialist, Family Child Welfare, Women's and Community Participation. Then Africa Regional Director. Then Manila, the Ford Foundation as representative. Then I think I taught. I was at the University of the Philippines here in sociology. Then the Ateneo invited me to come back to run the IPC again for 3 years, which I did. And then after that, because I had already retired from UNICEF, retired from the Ford Foundation, and I came back to the IPC in 2000. So retired from there, technically, in 2003, but stayed on. I still have an office there, and it's nice because I'm kind of the senior person around. They don't really pay me unless I have a project, and I have project funds, but otherwise I'm sort of there as the, advisor of sorts. And so after college I wanted to get a job, back to New York, but my parents had already moved to Williamson, so I stayed in the East End Hotel for Women, on the river, East River. And all right, so I was looking for jobs, looking in the newspaper and going to interviews. And I remember you had to have a hat, you had to have gloves. And people, then they would say, "Oh, you majored in what?" And I said, "Well, anthropology." And they'd say, "Anthropology? Why didn't you try the museum?" I said, "No, it's not archaeology. It's cultural, it's social, it's about people." And of course, nobody really understood what that was and what relation that might have to whatever job I was getting. In those days, for women, even with a college degree, it's going to be some kind of secretarial And then I was still a Filipino citizen. I hadn't gone to U.S. citizenship yet at the time. So some of them would have security clearances if it was government, I think. So that eliminated that. And then I guess I heard from somebody that the UN was a possibility. And because I was Filipino, that was an advantage. And so I went to inquire what would it take. And you could come in as a clerk typist, right? But you had to have 55 words a minute on a manual typewriter. I decided, well, I better go to a typing school. And so I found this hole-in-the-wall place on 42nd Street. It was so hot in New York. It was summer, June. And I took, I think, 20 hours of typing a week. So I think within 2 weeks I was already pretty, far. As soon as I made 55 words a minute regularly, without errors, then I went to the UN and took the typing test, and I passed. So I got a job at the UN, and first in the secretarial pool, the typing pool, which is really boring. All you had to do was fill in blanks of application forms that people had. And within, I think, a week or two, they said, oh, there's a place in the Department of Trusteeship and Information from Non-Self-Governing Territories. And in those days, they didn't have letterheads, so when you typed a letter from there, my fingers today still can do Department of Trusteeship and Information from Self-Governing Territories within half a minute, because you had to type that in every single time. And the boss of that unit was Ralph Bunch, who, of course, was a big shot and all of that. And we were all in awe of him. But I was on the 33rd floor, and I was the clerk typist. There were events at the UN, so it was a great environment. And then I got married, and I joined in, I guess it must have been July or something, and then got married in November, and then left in, when did I leave? I think May or April. So I was there about 8 to 9 months. Yeah. The boss of my section was Victor Kwong from Hong Kong. And the deputy was a British woman who was very straightforward. And while he was gone, she was running the department. So she wrote a letter to him, and I typed it out. And I wrote, Hong Kong, China, because, Hong Kong is China. And she said, did you send that out like that? I said, yes, it went out. And she said, Hong Kong is a British colony, you realize this? It was like a big international incident, and so I really got yelled at for that one. And, those little things you discover on diplomacy, and how you don't get on the elevator that goes to the 38th floor, because that's the Secretary General's floor. And that's his elevator, and only the top officials use that elevator. So you learn that you got to be. It's another, lesson that people who are in power have their separate elevators, and the rest of us. It was an awesome environment, because you would walk around inside the UN and you'd see these people going to meetings. Famous people. So it was a great job, I would say. I enjoyed it tremendously. And you really begin to appreciate how complicated the world is, and that there is a need for international arrangements to settle conflicts among countries and so on. 59, then I had Karen. Right, so I had 3 already. By that time I was doing the field work. I had done the field work already in the same town where we started to do our field work. And so I got a grant from the Community Development Research Council of the University of the Philippines to do that research, wrote it up, and that became my first book, The Dynamics of Power. No, the second book, Dynamics of Power in a Philippine Municipality, which I understand has now become a classic. I think that was my master's thesis, But that's because I really told the story about the community, how power relations were. And I have a chapter which Imagine, this was in 1959-60, which talked about the role that the women played, the wives of the politicians, and how they maneuvered things under the radar to make their husbands succeed, and because as a woman, you can't really sit in with the men's thing, but so I would sit with these women and they'd be chatting, and so I learned a lot just by listening to them and how they ran, how they maneuvered social relationships to the advantage of their particular husband or political party. And that chapter is still considered, something really revolutionary for the time. I graduated in 1960. I got the master's in 60. And then I went to a meeting of Sociological Society, which was every last Sunday of the month. And that's where I met Frank Lynch, Father Frank Lynch, who was an anthropologist who had come back the year before. And he was going to set up a Department of Sociology and Anthropology and an Institute of Philippine Culture as a research institute, and the two kind of go together. He said, you can teach in the grad school, because the grad school had women faculty, but they were all part-time. And he wanted me to get in on a full-time basis. So I was one of the first employees. And it's still there, and I'm still there. I mean, I started there in 1960. I was there until 79. I became the director in 71 to 78, then went to the UN in New York, and then to Nairobi with the UNICEF also. So I resigned from there in 79 or 78, went to UNICEF, and then returned to the Philippines, where I was the Ford Foundation representative for 5 years, 1992 until 97, and then I think taught at the University of the Philippines. And then in 2000, Ateneo asked me to come back and head the Institute of Philippine Culture, which I had done 20 years earlier or even before, to get it going again, because it had gone down. So I went back to it in 2000. The Ford Foundation had a big grant. They were phasing out of the Philippines, and part of their strategy was to allocate funds to institutions that had long been involved with, and they had been with the Institute for Philippine Culture for many years. So I was there when we negotiated $1 million grant for various reasons, to continue the research, but to integrate ourselves more into the university, because at the moment we were quite separate. We were under the president's office. We didn't have much to do with the teaching departments except sociology, anthro. So they said, you should really be more integrated in the university, so they take it over. So that was my task. And for that's why they gave me an honorary PhD, because I got them $1 million. Well, the high is that we were the only ones who were really doing field research at the time, social field research. So we were very famous, and we had people wanted us, were giving money to us to do research. That's in the 60s, right, and 70s, because we were the only act in town that was really organized that way. We were doing Peace Corps volunteer evaluations and all kinds of research. And I wrote what is considered a famous article called Reciprocity in the Lowland Philippines. That came out of my field research in this Bulacan town on values, Philippine values, because that's what we were looking at. So I really couldn't go out to the rural areas, which is what other people were doing. And then I think it was in 61 or 65 that he said, we have a project. Somebody wants us to do research in an urban area, in a low-income area of Manila. How about that, Because then I could just go there every day. I didn't have to stay overnight or anything, because I had all these kids. And so that's what happened. That's how I got to be very specialized. It's right on the port area, so people come in, migrants from all over, but how do you become a member of the community, and who's really from there and who's not, and what difference does it make, and how do they get integrated? So that was what I wrote about. And that, that got me a lot of fame, because nobody at that time was writing about urban. So I said, I have to take a master's. And I went to the anthro department and met the head of the department there, who said, you want to take a master's in anthropology? I tell this story to my anthropology students there all the time, and they laugh. And he said, why do you want to do that? I said, because it's a wonderful field. He said, there's no future for anthropology in this country. And I was so taken aback. And then, of course, later I realized it's because they only taught archaeology and physical anthro. They didn't have any cultural or social at all at the time. So I went into political science, which was kind of interesting. I had nice, interesting professors you talk about, you know, political events, international. But I said, this has no theory, just talk. I said, what kind of field is this? So I said, I better go back to sociology. Fortunately, that semester, there was a Fulbright professor, American anthropologist, who was teaching in the cultural anthropology. So I could take that as part of my coursework, which was 6 units, which is a lot. And that guy, Don Hart, is the one who really taught me how to do field work. Because there were 8 of us in the class, grad students. All of them 5 of them became very prominent anthropologists later on. But the 5 of us, you know, had never done field work. He said, you can't be an anthropologist unless you do field work. You have to talk to people, you know, that's what it's all about. So one of us came from a province not so far, a fishing community outside Manila. So she said, we would go there. So I got a truck from my father, borrowed it from the bank, and we would go there every Sunday. We'd spend all day Sunday there. And he would, you know, we would discuss, all right, what are we going to investigate, you know, fishing practices and the interaction and whatever. And then how do you classify it? There's this human relations area files, coding system. We learned how to do that on cards and all of that. I mean, that really taught me how to do field work. That you have to ask people about their lives, you know. That's what got me, again, solidly into anthropology. Then I began to, so I was studying anthro, but I decided I should work, you know, So I applied to the American school, and so I started to teach social sciences, 7th and 8th grade first. And 7th grade was American history. Fortunately, I had studied that at Hunter High. I didn't take American history in college. So Hunter High, I had a good course, so I could handle that. The 8th grade, I had to teach Asian history and Philippine history, and I never studied that. So I was really, you know, reading. I mean, just the night before, I'm trying to figure out what we're going to say. Fortunately, they had a textbook, which was a terrible textbook. But when I got to Philippine history, which was the 2nd semester, I enrolled in a class at University of the Philippines, because I was going to the University of the Philippines in Anthro, but there was a course downtown on Philippine history. So I would drive downtown and, you know, that for the evening class in Philippine history, and whatever the lesson I learned that night was my lesson the next day at the American school for Philippine history. I mean, that was really something, you know. Because first I taught 7th and 8th grade. They were tough because they were probably 12 and 13. But the following year I taught juniors. They were good because they were older and you could discuss things with them. So I liked that. I enjoyed that. So that's why I was doing my master's degree while I was teaching at the American school. Well, always the struggle of how do you deal with, you know, the family, and Helmut, you know, he was in business. Sometimes his own business career was quite up and down, while mine was standard. I wasn't making a fortune being an academic, but reasonably good. I had the standard salary every week, and his went up and down. Sometimes he earned a lot and sometimes not, especially when off on his own with some kind of partner, and whether the business would prosper or not, you know, was a problem. So there was that tension. He was tense about business. Then there's, you know, we had already 4 kids, and by the 63 we had 5 kids, and I think that's when we finally agreed that that's maybe time to stop. You know. As long, well, when I was in the country, that was not a problem. But then when I started traveling a lot, because I then went to conferences and gave seminars abroad and whatnot, then there were a lot of tensions that arose, which I could understand, because he got left with the 5 kids while I'm traveling around the world. So a lot of strains came from that, you know, that how do you manage all of that? And of course, since you have household help, at least they're taken care of, and at least somebody cooks their dinners and so on, but that doesn't really help the dynamics, you know, there. And that certainly led to a deterioration eventually. No, but it took a long time before that happened. I mean, mostly, you know, I think he appreciated it. He pretty much let me go ahead and do that until I think I went to that Peace Corps thing for 3 months. I was a trainer for Peace Corps volunteers in California for 3 summers, and that paid a lot. So, in a way, that was good for the family. I bought a refrigerator, you know, all of that, and I brought home a lot of money for that. So, in that sense, it was okay. At the same time, he was left with 5 kids for 3 months while I'm gallivanting, so-called, in California. So that didn't come off too well. And that you always had to resolve. How do you resolve that, you know? And you manage, you know. We did for 22 years, and then finally we said, that's it. Yeah, it didn't work. UNICEF I had given lecture talks at UNICEF and done a consultancy in Indonesia. I had given a talk in Hong Kong, and they had wanted to recruit me in 1977. And I had said, no, I'm in the Philippines. I have a family here. I'm happy here. You know, why am I going to go? And, you know, I didn't think Helmut was going to want to transfer it to New York. He didn't like New York at all. So I said no. But when this happened, and the third thing that happened that tilted that one, was the Minister of Social Welfare, who was another good friend of mine, because we were in the same cohort, came to me one day and she said, it was 77, you know, she said, I have an appointment for 1 year as a UNICEF consultant for the welfare of the child. They're doing the Convention of the Rights of the Child, and she was a child psychologist. She was the Secretary of Social Welfare in the Marcos administration, right? So she was a minister in his cabinet. And she said, we're looking for my replacement. So we have 3 names, and you're one of them. So I wanted to tell you that you're on our list. And I said, I'm on the list of the Marcos administration? No way, are you kidding? You know, I mean, I didn't tell her that, but I said, there's no way I can be with the Marcos administration. So I said to Helmut, this is serious, you know. You cannot say no to the president. If the president offers you that position, that's it. You have to take it, or you have to have a good reason why not. So then we talked, and he said, well, maybe now is the time to take that UNICEF position. So I wrote back to UNICEF, the person who had kind of informally written me and said, you know, we really like you for this position. I said, is that still open? I would like, you know. And they wrote back immediately and said, yes. I said, but the thing is, I had a grant from the Canadian IDRC, International Development Research Council, to do research on urbanization in Southeast Asia. I wouldn't be able to join until 1979, in the beginning. And they said, well, it's all right, we'll wait, you know, but just go through all the procedures. Yeah, and that's when we decided. Meanwhile, of course, Helmut and I were already splitting up. I mean, that also led to, now that, okay, and he said, you know, look, we're not really, this is not working out very well. And he found some other woman there in Davao. So, you know, he said, for our children, this is their opportunity, because the UN would pay for the ones who are under 21, and RDRC would pay for the travel of the ones who were over, because I was supposed to wind up in Canada to make this report. So all of them all their trips would be paid to the United States. And UNICEF, you know, when you're at UNICEF, you get a place to stay and all of that. So he said, this is their chance. You know, we've always said they should go to the United States. We'll never afford it. This is their only way. So we agreed this is the way to go. So I got the position in UNICEF, and we all left in August, I think. No, in June, because on the way I did research in Southeast Asia. So the kids came with me, except for Karen, because she was still in school. So we stayed in all kinds of interesting places, and on our way to New York, and we wound up there finally in 78. I got this annulment and then a divorce, so that was that. Of course, immediately, I was then maybe 55? Then of course people start wanting to match you up with someone. And I say, are you kidding? I'm free, I'm not getting connected with anyone anymore. I can do what I want, go where I want. So there was never any question of remarrying, for sure. Well, career as such started in 1960 when I became a member of the Institute of Philippine Culture. And that was a 19-year situation. Then I went to UNICEF. I mean, that's another old part of the career. Just to give you the trajectory, I went to UNICEF in 1970, late 79, was in New York for 3 years as the senior policy specialist for family, child welfare, women's participation, and I added community participation because I wanted to bring in people's organizing. So that's one part, 3 years. And then I was invited to become the regional director of UNICEF in Eastern and Southern Africa, based in Nairobi, and there's another whole story there. I was there 9 years and then retired from UNICEF. But I was supposed to go to Italy to be a research associate for 3 years. They had a special program to develop participatory processes in the country offices that I knew were interested in that, where community people have more say in what they need, want, decide, and so on. So I was supposed to lead a project on that. But just when that was being organized, the Ford Foundation called me and said, we have a position in Manila of representative. Would you be interested? And I thought, my goodness, going back to Manila as a Ford representative, wow, of course. So I said, yes, I'm interested. And then I went to New York, interviewed, and got the position. So came back to Manila after retiring from UNICEF in 1992. I was a Ford rep for 5 years until 97, and then retired from there, and was doing some teaching, research associate, and then rejoined the Institute of Philippine Culture in 2000 when we had to work out the Ford Foundation grant, actually, which was strange because I had come from Ford, and I was now the recipient instead of the donor. So UNICEF was, it was a great job. I was traveling all over. I was the advisor for many things, the whole women participation, family welfare, child welfare. And country offices would ask me to come and visit and help them with the program. So I was all over the place. I really enjoyed it greatly. That was really my international exposure. And because I went all over the world, different places where they call for you, and you go to the field. What's so nice about UNICEF, you don't just stay in the capital. You really go out where the programs are. You get a sense of what it's like. So you see the countryside or talk to ordinary people. And one of the things I was so appreciative of in Africa especially is you go to a village and they know you're coming. So they come out, dancing, singing, and it's all women, not just the beautiful, nubile young women. The women, old women, young girl, kids, it's just part of the welcome ceremony. So it's not, like here you only present the beautiful women and so on. So it was very natural. No, it was great. So that was really great, my exposure. And because I got known in the UNICEF world because I was ranked P5, which is the highest rank of professional. And there were no women yet at that level. So they invited me, because they had to be more gender conscious, to sit on the senior staff committee, executive committee, which would meet with the executive director every week. So I would sit there. And my pitch was participation, that if we make any changes, you always have to inform the people and discuss it with the people who are affected. That's a basic principle in community organizing. Then I got offered this position. And so Jim Grant, the executive director, called me in and said, you know, I would like to appoint you as the regional director for Eastern and Southern Africa. And I went, in Nairobi. And I went, oh my goodness, you know, that's of course a big promotion. But I said, you know, Mr. Grant, I mean, I'm quite taken aback, but I don't really know Africa. This is not my area. Southeast Asia has always been my area, you know. And there's also a regional director for that, based in Bangkok then. But he said, no, but I want you to go to Africa because, he said, you studied anthropology, didn't you? I said, yes. And he said, well, I want someone, you know, who has good leadership qualities, which you have, who understands cultural change, social change, ethnic issues, and you know, the whole sociocultural scene in Africa. And that's your background, right? And I said, yes. He said, so what's the problem? I said, well, I've never run anything this big, because there were 24 countries in that region. At that time, there were still fewer. There were about 18. They eventually became 24. But I said, I've never run anything that big. And he said, you don't have to worry about that. He said, once I appoint you, everything falls into place. So I said, well, I'm very appreciative. I said, but you know, I have, when was it, 1983. I said, my father is living with me, and he's 83, and my stepmother, she's, 70-something. I have to figure out what to do about them. And he said, take them with you. I said, you know, Nairobi. I'd never been to Nairobi, so I have no idea what is Nairobi like. He said, Nairobi's a great place. He said, they'll love it. So I said, oh my goodness, what am I going to do? So I went home that evening. I said to Grandpa, your grandpa, my father, you know what? And I explained, I've been offered this position as a regional director in Africa, in Nairobi. And he said, really? He said, let's go. I was taken aback. He just said, let's go. And Edith was sort of Africa, you know. But when he said that, I said, are you sure? He said, yeah, why not? And so we went. And that means that that's when the 5 kids, I think they moved out. The people whose house we were living were coming back, so they had to find another apartment, which they did in Flushing. And then I moved to Nairobi. But I got there the first month, I had to, so Edith and my father were there, but everybody was taking care of them. I had to go to Geneva for a 1-month refresher course in French. And that was something 24/7. I was so immersed in French because I had 5 French Francophone countries: Rwanda, Burundi, Madagascar, Mauritius, and Comore, French speaking. So I had to regain my French knowledge. But then I started. It was one of the great jobs. Day 1, I report, and I get a phone call from a young program officer, and she says, "This is May something. I'm in Mbabane. I'm thinking, where's Mbabane? I had no idea where's Mbabane. She says, and I'm calling because in Lesotho, next door, they have a snow emergency. And I'm going, a snow emergency? I'm in Africa, and there's a snow emergency. So, of course, thank goodness there were no face recognition things at the time, no Skype. Otherwise, you would have seen, I knew nothing. I mean, I was so taken aback. But, of course, you have to be calm. I say, well, stay calm. Tell them, what's the situation? Okay, there are how many marooned in the and you need what? And because only horses can get up there. Okay, you have a budget for horses? Can you get horses? Yes, we can, but we need to have authorization for. You're authorized, of course, do it. You know, and I had no idea what that was all about. So, of course, I had to do more studying of where are all these countries of which I'm the the overall director. But it was a great job, great job. So that was there 9 years. And after 6, normally it's a 6-year thing. And about the 7th year, there was no mention that I would move anywhere else. So I said to Mr. Grant, you're thinking of moving me anywhere? He said, why, you don't like it? And I said, oh no, I love it, it's great. And he said, you know my philosophy, it ain't broke, don't fix it. You like it, stay there, okay? I said, oh, fine. Because my father and Edith were having the best time of their lives. She often said later that was the best time of her life in Nairobi because we had this gorgeous, lovely house. I mean, it was a old farmhouse on a 5-acre lot, which had 3 acres of grass, and my father made a golf thing and flowers. He grew flowers, roses. He became a specialist in roses. And then we had a goat that followed him around who we called Nicholas because some villager gave him to me when I was visiting. And so he would follow my father around. He was very smart. He never ate the flowers, only the grass. And I always had beautiful roses in my room because he got lovely ones. So he really enjoyed being there. So it was really a lovely time. We were there 9 years. But he died there in 80.
Well, we came in 87. He died in 88.
Yeah. That was really something. When he died, our household help, they began to chant African eulogy songs. That was so touching for him. And so then, we transferred his body and all the way up to Williamson, there to that cemetery there. That was something. So we were there until 83 to 92. And then we came back, and I was supposed to go to Florence, but instead I came back to Manila. We were the #1 region that was most admired because the representatives, having learned or appreciated that way that they're trusted to know what they're doing and that they're actually listened to, and would do that in their own offices, we were booming. Our region was the most successful when it came to getting the programs done and sustained, and working with government and NGOs. We worked a lot with the NGOs. Every time there was a vacancy, I would look as much as possible for an African, and especially if I could find an African woman, even better. Not exclusively, because it had to be a mix. You couldn't have it all African, and the advantage is when you have many different nationalities, it's a big plus. But more of a mix. There were no Africans virtually in any of these senior positions when I get there, and so I made a point of looking for talented Africans and appointed some very good ones. And I think people really, appreciated that. So, yeah, that's what an anthropology background can do. I think when I ran the regional meetings and all those reps were there and trying to get them to reach consensus on something, which I would then report back to New York. And when I reported that, they knew that I was representing 24 people, not just me. They knew that because they knew how I ran the region. So, you know, I guess that was the peak. In New York, I was recognized as being one of those who had kind of a special way of running the region that seemed to bring out the best in most people, anyway. Plus, I guess, again, Papa always, you know, remembering, he always said, there are always two sides to an issue, because I would be arguing about something, and he said, okay, but there's always another side. What's the other side? And I said, they're wrong. What is the other side? At least find out. Otherwise, you're going to be very weak if you don't know who your competition is. You know, so that I remembered also from there. You have to ask the people who have the problem. What's the problem? One is her lack of regard for custom, culture, tradition, the normal way of doing things, but challenging that. Not that you always did abnormal things, but that you challenge something that doesn't look right to you. That one, I guess, I got from her. From him, it's just that you have to be focused, know where you know what you want to do, or try to find out, and be painstaking. I mean, work on something, but be fair. Be fair. Yeah, and honest. He was saying honest. You have to be honest. So I guess those values of striving. You have to strive. You have to work hard to achieve something. You know? And then always look at all sides of a question. I think first my kids and the grandkids, although you have much less control, fortunately, over them. But my kids, I think a mark of success has to be how well your kids are. And it doesn't mean how much money they're making particularly, but just are they good people? Are they doing what they like to do and what they do well? Or if they, you know, are they doing okay? Doing well and bringing up their own kids. I think that's the number one measure of yourself. I guess my students, you know, I've always taught and always try to convey to them some of these values, which are really very certain values about how you should be as an academic, as a person, as an academic, that you don't have to be this authoritarian personality, that people learn much more if they feel that you are interested in them, that you really want them to learn, and they get inspired if they feel that you really care, that they learn something, and that they're interested in something. And I mean, very often they say, you know, wow, you taught me this, or they'll say something complimentary, and you know, there's no way I can pay you back. And I always say, you don't have to pay me back. Come on, people did this for me. You know, Mrs. Schwaneman, Father Lynch, my parents, they did it for me. So I'm only passing on the good that was given to me to you. So you should do the same for your, whatever you have, students, family, employees, whatever you do in life. You know, just pass it on. You live your life, but you do something for others, especially people who have less. You know, you're so privileged. I mean, when you are privileged, you know, you have to share it in some way. You can't just keep it to yourself. You have to do what you can. And not everybody can do that, you know. But I had the privilege of being able to do that. So, so that would be the thing, that you try to make the world a better place. And one way of doing that is for people who have so much less, who are marginalized, often, you know, by structures that make it so difficult for them to get out of the situation they're in, that you have to help not only them, but to change the structures, at least try to maneuver those structures so that they can move and have a more decent life for their children. Because if there's anything that's universal in the world, it's that parents want a better life for their children. You know? And that's why working for UNICEF was wonderful, because you could always count on that would be the case. Of course, a lot of violence, and that's what you have to deal with. But you know, you start with such an advantage because children should be the first concern. And that was what we believe. So that's what I would say. You know, doing something, especially for those who are least advantaged, enabling them to do it, not to do things for them, but whatever, helping remove whatever constraints there are, or supporting what capacities they have that can be enhanced. I hope you can find a job that can do good things for people, not in a patronizing way, you know, but really in an empowering way. I don't know if I would have known that when I was 20, but if I were. So I hope you can find a job that you love doing. And I'm so lucky because my whole life I've always loved the job that I've done. And if you love what you're doing, you know, you're usually good at it. Not always, but you're usually good because you put effort into it and you try to learn it better if you don't know. And you really get passionate about it, and that things have to work right. You know? So I feel very privileged that I always loved what I was doing. I always say find something that you really believe in. It doesn't have to be in social services. You don't have to be like me. But whatever you do it well and do it, you know, hopefully it serves not only your interests or your own family's interests, but it serves other people's well-being in some way. We got to make this world a better world, and environmentally, et cetera, et cetera.